Oh, okay. All right. Hello, and welcome to our webinar presented by Manhattan Psychology Group. My name is Andrew, and I am the Professional Development Coordinator, and I'm also a BCBA, and I'm here to help host and MC today's webinar. We are excited that you have chosen us today during this asynchronous webinar, which we have pre-recorded for your convenience. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So before we begin today's webinar, I want to give you all a quick reminder on how to earn your CEUs. So during the webinar, we will be mentioning two code words at the beginning and at the end of the presentation. You are going to need to remember these code words in order for you to earn your CEU certificate. The code words will be displayed clearly on the screen and they will only be mentioned once. So please make sure you're paying close attention and write them down as soon as you see them. And at the end of the webinar, you will be asked to complete a short post-webinar survey. And once you finish that survey, you will immediately receive your CEU certificate in your Thinkific account. And as a reminder, this webinar is offering BCBA's One Ethics CEU. But if you are not a BCBA, that's totally okay. We are so happy that you are here to join us. You can request a certificate of attendance upon request. All right, next slide, please. Perfect. So before we begin today's featured presentation, I want to tell you all about Manhattan Psychology Group. We were founded in 2011. Manhattan Psychology Group is a multidisciplinary team consisting of adult and child psychologists, neuropsychologists, special educators, BCBAs, and ABA therapists. We specialize in providing wraparound care from psychological testing services to ABA services for individuals of all ages. Our services are available at our Upper West Side and Long Island City offices, as well as clients' homes, schools, and community locations. We offer various payment options, including private pay, commercial health insurance, and DOE impartial hearing options. Next, please. Our vision at Manhattan Psychology Group is to create a future where individuals and their families feel supported, connected, and empowered. Just like this webinar that you are watching today with us, we want to provide educators, parents, and families with all the kinds of support that they need. Next, please. And our mission at Manhattan Psychology Group is to provide multidisciplinary integrated support for individuals and their families who experience mental health, behavioral, and educational challenges. All right, next, please. And now, without further ado, I am so excited to introduce to you all today's speaker. Today we have Blanca Franck. Blanca is a talented and hardworking board-certified behavior analyst from Queens, New York. She holds a dual Master of Arts degree in Applied Behavior Analysis and Education from Teachers College at Columbia University, with a background in psychology and education. Blanca has extensive experience in ABA, having worked in private and general education school settings, as well as providing in-home services. Her work reflects her passion for youth development, psychology, and education. Blanca is dedicated to using ABA principles and advanced teaching strategies to ensure the success of each child and family that she works with. She is a New York State certified teacher for students with disabilities and excels in providing individualized instruction. As a bilingual English and Spanish speaker with a multicultural background, Blanca is particularly passionate about assisting multicultural families who face challenges in finding appropriate education and support. And I also resonate a lot with Blanca as well as myself as an Asian American who has a lot of experience serving a similar population with similar cultural needs. Uh, Finally, Blanca's wealth of knowledge and experience combined with her collaborative approach enables her to make a meaningful impact in the lives of the families that she serves. We are super delighted to have her here today to speak about her experience and her insights during today's webinar, ABA and Culture, Understanding the Intersection of Applied Behavior Analysis and Cultural Awareness. So without further ado, let's bring Blanca to the spotlight and have our talk today on this topic.
Andrew, that was so nicely said. Thank you so much. That was like
You're welcome.
as like a great MC. I'm gonna have to have you as my personal MC forever. As Andrew was saying, yeah, today we are going to be talking about ABA and culture and understanding that intersection between applied behavior analysis and cultural awareness. It definitely is an area that is of just passion for me as an individual and as someone who has been in the field for a very long time and also have personal relationships with family members and gaining access to services and how that impacted us culturally. So just a little outline about what we're going to be reviewing and talking about today is we're going to first do a quick overview of understanding the basics of what is ABA and what are its principles. The reason that I'm going over this briefly is because we do have some people who are not BCBAs, and that's very exciting. So I always want to do a quick little review. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the impact of culture and how it affects ABA practices. Then we're going to move on to developing cultural competencies within the practice, and then we're going to practice. I feel like I'm saying practice a lot, and hopefully you won't hear it as much in this webinar. Okay, so let's start off with the first thing that we were talking about. What is ABA? To answer it simply, and if there ever is a simple answer to it, it's a systematic approach to understanding and improving behavior. So it really entails studying why people do what they do, and then using that knowledge to help individuals learn new skills, reduce problem behaviors, and improve their overall quality of life. And that last point is really, really important. That quality of life for our learners is really important to make sure that any practices that we're doing is often used to promote a positive change in behavior. So that kind of leads me into the second point of saying that ABA is often used in different environments, whether that be in education, therapy, and any setting that we use this in. Again, the emphasis on making sure that we have those positive behavior chains. And that's why we have that cute little section in the bottom of keywords to pay attention to and reflect on. And since this is asynchronous and you want to kind of reflect, I invite you to write about it, journal, talk about it with a friend or a coworker. But those two key points of improving overall quality of life and making sure that it's positive behavior change. So I'll let you guys do with what you please with that. Moving on to the next side, kind of going into more on improving quality of life and those positive behavior changes. There's a few things and like talking points that I like to discuss, and there's an overview for. The first part is that there's independence and autonomy, right? So we want to make sure that the individuals that we're working with, that they become more self-sufficient, that they are allowed to make choices, and that these decisions overall contribute to their independence and sense of control. That autonomy is very important, especially for our younger learners. And I think sometimes we can forget that when we're so lost in doing trials and meeting milestones and getting assessments done. The overall goal should always be independence and autonomy. The other point that I love to talk about is enhancing well-being. So ABA typically helps individuals to develop skills that are necessary to have a more fulfilling and overall happier and satisfying life. That's, not the most textbook definition of ABA, but as a provider who is interested in the well-being of others and their students and their learners, this should be at the forefront of what we're doing. Inclusivity is another one. We want to make sure that individuals are able to participate in different aspects of their life. We want to make sure that we can help them with things like education, access to appropriate education, employment, recreational activities, social activities. And then the last part, which I think ties everything very beautifully, is dignity and respect. We want to make sure that all the practices that we use within ABA are ethical and that they focus on ensuring that we are being respectful, considerate, and that we're focusing on each person's and learner's individual unique preferences and needs. So I will jump off my soapbox and move on to the next slide. Okay, this will always be in my brain for years and years to come. It's one of the first things we learn as BCBAs when we're learning about what ABA is, and it's called Get a Cab. For us New Yorkers, this is right for home for us. And basically the acronym just kind of overviews some of the principles that we have when it comes to ABA. So I'll briefly review these, and hopefully you can put me in slow-mo with the webinar if you ever want to do a more in-depth version of this. But the acronyms are basically analytical, behavioral, generality, effective, technological, applied, conceptually systematic. That's Get a Cab. So now I find that typically I learn through examples. So I wanted to start off with understanding what ABA is through a few case studies. We're going to review some of these a little bit faster because I do want to get to the meat of what our webinar is about, which is cultural awareness, but we'll have some fun with this. So the first case study is to work on communication, which is important for a child with autism. So let me put on a few things. Maria is a 5-year-old child with autism, had difficulty expressing her needs, leading to frustration and challenging behaviors. Her ABA therapist implemented a plan that focused on using picture exchange cards as a means of communication. The therapist meticulously tracked Maria's progress, measuring how often she was successfully using the cards to request or express her feelings. Over time, Maria's communication skills improved significantly, and she was able to interact more effectively with her family and peers, both at home and in school. So I'm going to give you guys not much seconds because you'll be able to pause me if you need to. But if you are wanting to journal or write about it, please feel free to kind of write what you think before I move into the why of this. Let's review why each case study is following the principles of ABA, or how we can reflect on the proper use of ABA and why. So take your time to go over that and write, and then I'm going to move on to the next explanation. But if you guys want to pause me at any point, please feel free to do that. Okay, so I lied to everyone. I'm going to explain it to you. So in this situation here, one of the things that I really like about this case study and this example is the fact that we are seeing a significant improvement in the child's life. We're seeing that some of these difficulties that she was having was because she had an inability to express herself. So we then incorporated a program that is based by the science, it's empirical, we have research to back it, and we're seeing a significant improvement in Maria's life. She's able to now successfully communicate with her family, her friends, and we're seeing those decreases in those challenging behaviors, and we're giving her an access to more things in her environment at home and at school, because we saw those reductions in challenging behaviors. We're also making sure that we're meticulously, I like that word, tracking her progress, and we're making sure that nothing that we're using is punitive or outside of the reach of what we do in ABA. So I hope that is a sufficient explanation. If you guys are really, really interested in these case studies, maybe Andrew and I will do another one on just the principles of ABA. What I will do for the next couple of case studies is I will read them to you, allow you guys to go ahead, journal on them, put your opinions down. If you guys want to reach out to us and with your responses, you're more than welcome to. But I'm going to read these, give you a few seconds to reflect on why they're proper or not proper use of ABA, and then move on so that we get to the meat of the webinar. So case study 2, academic improvement for a student with ADHD. John, a student with ADHD, faced academic challenges in the classroom. His teacher implemented an intervention to enhance his academic performance. The intervention aimed to provide additional support during class, including more one-on-one time with the teacher and simplified instructions. I'll give you a second. I know it's not going to be easy. You guys probably have so many opinions, but I'll let you write about them. And if you want to share your opinions, I'm pretty sure Andrew can give everyone access to my email, and you guys can send me your opinions on this. All right, case study number 3, reducing anxiety in a child with selective mutism. Meet Sarah, a 6-year-old child diagnosed with selective mutism, a condition that causes severe anxiety in social situations. A team of ABA therapists conducted a comprehensive assessment to identify specific anxiety-related behaviors. They defined the target behaviors such as avoiding eye contact, physically withdrawing, and refusing to speak in social settings. Data were collected systematically, tracking the frequency and duration of these behaviors during social interactions. The therapist designed a systematic intervention plan, what a tongue tweezer, gradually exposing Sarah to controlled social situations and providing reinforcement for verbal approximations. Over time, Sarah's anxiety-related behaviors reduced significantly, and she began to communicate more comfortably in social settings, improving her overall quality of life. I'm really curious to see what you guys come up with this. So if you really are like moved by it and want to send me an email, please do. I will encourage you for case study number 3, where we're going to move on to the next part. Okay, so I always like to say that one of the things about ABA is we always want to prove it with the research. Nothing that we say in these webinars, at least the ones that Andrew and I do and what MPG does, is never based on just because we told you so. So I always provide a slide for you guys with some research studies. And because this is asynchronous, feel free to screenshot me with my silly face on the screen, and feel free to get all the points from here. And if you want to do some digging and some research and prove me wrong, I challenge you to do so. All right, guys, we're going to move on to now the second part, which is the real meat of what we're doing today, is talking and understanding what culture is. In its most basic form, culture refers to the shared beliefs, values, customs, traditions, behaviors, and practices that characterize a particular group of people or a society. It typically encompasses various aspects of human life, including language, religion, social norms, art, cuisine, etc. And then culture typically shapes how individuals within certain groups interact with each other and with the world around them. And with the next couple of slides, we're going to see how that plays into ABA. So I'm really excited to start this with you guys. Okay, so some more examples on culture. I'll move through these briefly because I think we do all have our own personal relationships with culture and how we identify with culture. So these examples are just additional stuff for you guys to ponder on. Language and communication, that's a big one, especially here in New York, where we are always exposed to different languages and different people. So the best way I try to explain it in this example is, in Japan, bowing is a common form of greeting and respect, reflecting their cultural values of humility and politeness. In contrast, here we shake our hands and, you know, we have cool handshakes and all these crazy stuff we do with our hands, and that's just how we show openness and equality. And it's interesting to see that change and how communication changes across different areas. Religious practices. For example, during Ramadan, observant Muslims typically fast and from sunrise to sunset as an act of devotion and self-discipline. This cultural practice is an integral part of Islamic religious beliefs and traditions. And so is an example of just how many different ways religion practices can impact a learner's and individual's life outside of just a session, outside of ABA. Family structure. This is something that is close to my home, and this example is similar to how I grew up. But in most South American cultures, extended families often live together. I remember living in a house with 12 people, whereas my counterparts lived like with 1-2 people, or preferred a nuclear environment where it's just like smaller families. Whereas I think I grew up with, how we say in Spanish, el entero barrio, like we lived with everyone. And so that's another thing to take into consideration, our family structure. How many people are in the home? What environment that creates, that nuclear culture within the home. And then just societal norms. In some cultures, removing one's shoes before entering the house is common practice, and that's like a sign of respect and you have to do it. And in other cultures, it's less common, like in Western cultures. So that's another interesting part of this, and some more examples of culture. And then I think to the part we were all hoping to get to sooner than later is, how does culture and ABA intersect? And there's a few things that I think are important to touch on. It's really crucial to consider culture in ABA therapy because it ensures that we're being respectful, we're being effective, and that we're using ethical interventions that both respect individuality, they enhance effectiveness, they fulfill ethical responsibilities, and they promote generalization and maintenance of learned behaviors. So breaking that down a little bit, we want to talk about that respect for individuality. Culture shapes beliefs, values, and behaviors, and that makes it essential. So that makes it essential for us as ABA practitioners to find interventions that are tailored to each client's unique cultural background and preferences. We want to make sure that the next key point that we're talking about in that enhancing effectiveness is not just effective in terms of what we do for our intervention methods and how we're collecting data and how we're meeting mastery criteria and generalization, but we also want to be culturally sensitive with our ABA approaches to make sure that we're promoting engagement trust and cooperation, which then in turn actually leads us to have a more effective intervention and more positive behavior change because we're attuned to what's happening around our learners and their culture. The next part, which is really important, is ethical responsibility. As ABA practitioners, we have an ethical duty to make sure that we are being respectful of culture diversity, that we're avoiding discrimination, and that we're making sure that our top priority is the well-being and the dignity of our clients and their families. I think that resonates with a lot of us when we go into homes that are different than ours. And as BCBAs, we're always wearing different hats. The next part, which I brought up briefly, is generalization and maintenance, right? So we have to really consider how culture fosters that generalization of skills beyond just therapy settings, making sure that the things that our clients are learning can be applied in a culturally relevant situation, and that then we're leading to lasting positive outcomes because of that ability to take in our clients and our learners' culture. So this is where, I don't know if Andrew wants to take over, but I know he told you all very well about the code words. So the very first code word here is respect, which I love. Makes me want to sing it.
RESPECT. That's
Mhm.
right. Thank you. So yes, our first code word is respect. Make sure you write it down. We're only going to keep it up here for a few more seconds. Yeah, just make sure that you have this code down because at the end of this webinar, you will need to input it for your CEU certificate.
There we go. And then doomsday
Yeah.
clock. 3, 2, 1, over. And again, I really love how this just goes straight in to prove it with the research. I know I'm throwing a lot at you guys, and I typically have a fast rate of speaking. So I hope that MPG gives you guys the opportunity to put me in slow-mo if needed. But here are some more research studies that talk about the effectiveness of culture and ABA practices and the importance of cultural competence in behavior analytic practice. These are two studies that I read in preparation for this webinar that really reinforced some of the beliefs that I had as a provider, but also provided new information that I did not know. So I really do encourage you guys to take a look at these studies and let me know your thoughts. Reach out, let me know your thoughts. Okay, so now we're going to do a more deeper dive into what cultural competency is in ABA, and I particularly love to do this, as you can tell so far in the webinar, through case studies. So we're going to start off with cultural competence. ABA practitioners need to be culturally competent, which basically means that they understand and respect the cultural backgrounds and values of their clients. Cultural competence is essential in providing effective and ethical ABA services, as we reviewed in the previous slides. And when we understand a client's cultural norms and communication styles, we can actually help tailor these interventions more appropriately. So you're hearing some of the same verbiage that I said that I used previously in the lead up to this. And I'm hoping that now through these case studies, we can really highlight how we're being culturally competent within our ABA practices. So let's go back to this situation, first case study with this child named Maria, and she is a nonverbal child with autism. So Maria is a 6-year-old nonverbal child with autism. She was receiving ABA therapy. Her ABA therapist, Sarah, recognizes the importance of cultural competence in delivering effective services. Maria's family, originally from a Middle Eastern country, had specific cultural norms and communication styles. They valued extended family involvement and had a preference for non-verbal cues like eye contact and gestures. Sarah engaged in cultural competence by learning about Maria's family culture, involving extended family members in therapy sessions, and adapting communication strategies to align with the family's preferences. This approach built trust and rapport with Maria's family, enhancing the effectiveness of the ABA interventions. And then Maria made significant progress in communication and social skills, benefiting from culturally sensitive therapy. So I love, love, love this case study. And there's a few things that I really want to point out right away, is the fact that the provider, Sarah, took the time to understand Maria's family and their culture. She made sure that she involved the family into the therapeutic practices. And I think that that's something as providers that sometimes we forget to do. Sometimes we are so excited to make programming because we've studied, we've busted our chops getting to know everything that we know, and the research is there, and it can be a lot of jargon. And we forget to translate that over for our families, who, at the end of this is what the point is. The point is to make sure that our families are understanding and can replicate and continue this after our authorization period ends, after our bank of hours are done. The point is to make sure that the family can also have competence with their child. And the best way to do that is to make sure that we are fitting the cultural norms and the communication styles in this example for our learners. Had Sarah not taken into consideration that the family had a preference for eye contact and gestures, had she not taken the time to align her strategies with Maria's extended family, we don't know if we would see carryover. We don't know if the family would be equipped to continue generalizing those skills outside of session. But because she was very culturally sensitive, we were able to see, at least in this case study, that she's making progress in her communication and overall impacting and benefiting her for the long run, which is what's the most important part here. Yeah. We're going to move on to another case study. And this has to do with James, a teenager with oppositional defiant disorder. This one is a very tricky one for providers who have not dealt with this before. I invite you to take a look at this specific diagnosis. It can be very difficult to manage, specifically within an ABA realm. And different cultures are going to have a different reaction. Even as providers, we have different reactions to certain diagnoses, this one in particular. So let's go over this case study. James, a 15-year-old with ODD, exhibited challenging behaviors at school. His ABA therapist, Lisa, recognized that cultural factors played a role in James' behavior. He came from a culture that emphasized respect for authority figures and hierarchical structures. Lisa considered cultural sensitivity when designing interventions for James. Instead of imposing a traditional behavior plan, she collaborated with James' family and school to align interventions with cultural values. The intervention focused on providing alternative ways for James to express frustration and navigate authority respectfully, leading to significant improvements in his behavior and school performance. So this is kind of where I really want to draw the focus back onto that respect for authority figures. Every culture has a different way of dealing with elders or who we consider authority figures. In a South American household where I was born and raised, you never called an adult by their first name. You greeted, kept your head down, and then don't make direct eye contact, which is interesting, right? Because it's something that we teach differently. Like it's so different. And I don't know, Andrew, you unmuted, so you might be excited.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on that note that I had the same type of upbringing in which that, you want to show humbleness, respect your elders, during a meal, let the oldest one eat first.
Yeah.
Taking your shoes off before you come into the house, lots of things like that. We
Yeah.
have the same values, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of, like how Andrew just demonstrated, like we come from completely different backgrounds, but very similar experiences. And specifically for our learners, we want to make sure that we teeter that line of respecting authority figures, but also going back and reflecting on that child's autonomy and their ability to speak up for themselves. And what I really, really like about this example is that Lisa didn't just disregard this almost authoritative cultural background that James came from, but instead she found ways to navigate around it. She found ways to accommodate to some of those practices that are aligned with James's family's cultural values, but then found ways to say, how can we navigate that? How can we ensure that James is having improvements in his behavior, that we're giving him autonomy, that we're focusing on him being able to advocate for himself, his independence. So that I really love this example, and I can go on hours and hours for this, but we don't have hours and hours, and I don't think you want to sit here and listen to me for hours and hours. So let's move on to the next one. And then if you have any questions, again, reach out to me. I'm really passionate about this stuff. Okay. The next one is when we are talking about cultural competency and ABA. And we touched about it a little bit in our previous example. Yes, I'm bringing it up again because I love it so much, but we were talking about customization of our interventions. We want to make sure that when we do intervention plans for our learners, that they're individualized and they're culturally relevant, how we saw in the previous examples. So some examples provided highlighted that cultural practices such as family structures or religious beliefs can significantly impact a person's life. As ABA practitioners, we want to consider that these cultural factors are going to play a role when we are customizing our interventions. And we want to make sure that we're not just copying and pasting interventions for each learner. No learner learns the same way, in the same way that each learner's household and cultural expectations are different. So I want to kind of go over this case study and show how we do that as practitioners. So Lila, a child with ADHD and cultural differences. So Lila is an 8-year-old who has ADHD, and she comes from a family with cultural practices that influence her daily routine and behavior expectations. Her ABA therapist, David, recognized the importance of customization when making her intervention. So he made sure to align this with Layla's cultural background. So David worked very closely with Layla's family to understand their cultural values and expectations. And then together they developed behavior plans that incorporated culturally relevant rewards and consequences. When he respected and integrated the family's cultural factors, Layla's treatment became more effective and aligned with her family's preferences, resulting in an improvement in behavior and family satisfaction. So one of the best, more specific examples that I like to use when it comes to customizing interventions is sometimes as providers, when we focus on vocational or household skills, we focus a lot on eating with a fork, eating with a spoon, using utensils. And for many of my learners, that is just not the case. They eat with their hands. They prefer to use chopsticks. I've had family members who have different utensils, when they use it, how they use it, when they're mixing their foods together, how they mix their foods together, dietary restrictions. And so in cases like this, where we're wanting to make sure that we are making daily routines for our students and making behavioral expectations for those routines, we really need to be aware of what the family's everyday life is. So for example, if one of the routines that they were having for Layla here is that, she's going to sit at the table and she's going to eat with a fork and spoon, but mom and dad and brother and sister are all eating with their hands, we're never going to meet mastery criteria because she's never going to practice it outside of session. And is that the most important thing to be targeting in our interventions for our students, to be harping on something that doesn't align with their cultural beliefs? That probably won't be something that's going to be maintained by the family, and it's not going to let the family feel respected or heard in the cultural aspects. Yeah. And there's a different story to be told if the family wants that. Then, that's a conversation to be had, and that's something to be discussed. But I really like the fact that we want to make sure with anything that it's customized and it's socially significant, not to us, not to our culture, our nuclear culture, but to that student and their culture and their needs. Okay, another time I'll get off my soapbox. The other thing, and we touched a little bit about it in some of the previous examples, are communication styles. And that is such a hot topic in ABA. Communication, tact, repertoires, AAC device, PEC symbols, what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing? I mean, people can go all day talking about how to use communication and how to develop it. I kind of I give the advice and I pose the question of how can we make sure that whatever communication modality we're using within ABA research, how can we make sure that it understands how culture shapes communication styles, right? Including verbal and nonverbal cues that are essential for effective communication within family structures. So it's really important when we're looking at our assessments and when we're doing intervention methods to take into consideration some of those communication styles that are reinforced in different cultures. For instance, some cultures may use indirect communication or nonverbal cues to express their feelings, which ABA practitioners should recognize and respect, right? We're not always having cultures that are super hyper-focused on eye contact. Some cultures find that very disrespectful. And so we see a decrease in that in our learners because it's not a behavior that's relevant or socially significant to that household. So I bring back the example of a student with selective mutism. Miguel, a 6-year-old child with selective mutism, displayed anxiety-related behaviors in social situations. His ABA therapist, Maria, considered how cultural norms influence Miguel's communication style. Miguel came from a culture where indirect communication and nonverbal cues were common. Maria adapted her approach by incorporating strategies that respected Miguel's communication preferences. She used visual aids and nonverbal prompts to encourage Miguel's communication in a culturally sensitive way. This approach helped Miguel overcome his selective mutism, allowing him to communicate more comfortably in various social settings. I really like this example because when we're not focusing on what the child's comfort is, not only within themselves, an individual, but within their culture, we're really doing a disservice because we're trying to teach a completely different skill that is probably being punished or not being used in the home. And when I say punished, I don't mean that as like punitive. I mean that as just they're not contacting any reinforcement for using it, right? So if Miguel's form of communication were to briefly look at his mom or to raise his hand or to make a gesture or to tap the table to get her attention in a respectful manner, and we're trying to teach him to be loud, to stare at her, and to like scream, he's not really going to get mom's attention, and he might actually contact some, negative comments or like, hey, don't do that, or oh, you're being too loud. And then we come in to do our session and we're like, hey, get louder, so there's different things to take into consideration. And I know sometimes, especially when we're starting off, our assessment tools are the most important thing for us, but I really do challenge you to try to adapt your assessments and your interventions to what is immediately relevant to the family and their culture within their home.
That is such a nice note, and I want to piggyback on that comment with one of my families that I work with. They come from Asian culture. So when I was first starting out with that family, we all have to do an assessment to figure out a baseline about their behavior and their skills and communication and etc. And I had purchased one of those like kits, for the VB map that where they supply you with all the pictures and the
Yeah.
materials and stuff. And I thought it was great when I initially purchased it because it had a ton of like these flashcards. I thought I was getting a really good deal, with all the pictures, five different pictures of an apple and, you know, wow. But the point that I was trying to make was that there were a lot of foods and like snacks that this family has never seen before, nor will uh I don't think they ever will. Things like American candies that they don't purchase for their child, um, pictures of stores and places, of supermarkets that, they've never seen before. Just things that, are not common culturally as an Asian child growing up in New York City. So I took the liberty and the time to adjust those picture cards to, pictures of things that are, more common within his vicinity. I thought that was a better way of accurately, collecting data on his level of skills because obviously he's not going to know, what a picture of a field in Nebraska is, and point out that that's a field right there, just there are lots of they don't know everything and we have to tailor it so that it's culturally competent.
Yeah, 100%. Andrew, 100% hit the nail on the head. Also, just
Thank
like
you.
there are things that I, as an adult, don't know to this day, like certain foods that people are like, oh, did you ever eat this? I'm like, what is that? I don't know.
Hmm.
And then,
Hmm.
then we go into sessions and we're like forcing these things that our kids don't learn or don't even care. They don't need to know it. And we're trying to force it on them. And yeah, it's definitely something to really pay attention to.
Right.
Okay. So I'm loving all these case studies, but I do want to make sure that we have some time to get through the rest of the material. We have so many good things for you guys, so many worksheets and examples. And so I'm going to kind of review a little bit about some touching points like the respect for diversity that we reviewed earlier, about making sure that we really are, with anything that we do as ABA practitioners, every time we go into the home, it's with respect, not just for the family's culture or for where they come from or embracing their cultural diversity, but just for the individual and the family as a human being. We want to make sure that everything that we do, all the strategies and the interventions that we use, that we're making sure that it is from a place of respect. A place of respect for their diversity, for their culture, and for who they are becoming as an individual. And so hopefully you'll be able to take a little screenshot or go over this case study on your own, reflect on it, journal on it. As you can tell, I have a thing for journaling. I think it's very good to get your ideas out on paper, and it really helps just build those cultural competencies within our practice. As you can tell, one of the biggest things that we've been talking about this whole time is that key point of collaboration with the families. Sometimes as ABA providers, we can get very into the mode of, I'm going into the session, I'm working with my kid, I'm leaving. My data's in, my session notes are in, my kid's making progress, and that's wonderful, and we want that. But when the parents have no idea what you're doing, are we really doing a service? You know, we want to keep these families involved, and especially when it comes to things like cultural tendencies and practices, because then that way the family is our unit to understanding what's happening in their home and what's significant to them. So again, I'm going to leave this case study up here for you. I don't want to take away from any of these points that I'm going through or rushing through. These are all very important, and they're all important things to consider. And then again, the ethics, the ethical considerations of what we're doing is so important when we're looking at awareness of cultural differences, because we want to make sure that we're preventing for things like stereotypes and unintentional biases, and that we're not just influencing assessments and intervention decisions because that's what's true to us and that's true to our culture and to our overall culture outside of the student's home, that we're not just trying to assimilate them into a culture that isn't theirs, but that we're working in conjunction with their culture, with their beliefs, and giving them what they need to be able to access a happy, fulfilling, and socially significant life in conjunction with who they are as a person, what they believe, and their cultural aspects. So again, this is not to diminish, because this is a very, very important point, but I do want to make sure we cover everything in our webinar. Okay. And again, back to our slide with prove it with the research. I don't say anything because it's what I think. I say it because the research is proving it, and we have studies here that back up the statements that we make. So feel free to take these and look them through and really, really put them as part of your arsenal as a BCBA, because I think they are very important to what we do as providers. Okay. One of the things that I really like to do for myself and for providers is making sure, like, how can we as ABA providers assess ourselves? We're always assessing our students, right? Like, let's turn the tables and make sure that we know some of those, milestones and check marks for cultural competency. So the first step is really a self-assessment. We want to reflect on our own cultural biases. So that means identifying any biases or beliefs that we may have that might influence our interactions. And then we want to kind of assess what our cultural awareness is of our students. I will definitely say, growing up in a South American household, when a student wasn't, like, when we weren't listening, or when a student wasn't listening, the first thing I would hear my parents or like extended family say is like, that child is so rebellious. They have no idea what they're doing. Instead of then taking a step back and looking at it with a point of compassion and saying, hey, that child is not communicating, or they're frustrated because they have no idea what that picture is, or they're being told to look at this person in the eye, but eye contact is so uncomfortable for them and they don't do it in their practice. I think that's a very different lens. And as providers, and as we're learning to manage our students, we really do want to make sure that we know our own biases before we can even step into the home and have any culturally competent practices. The next step is that cultural understanding component. You really want to take the time to learn about what your client's culture is. Take some research, look at the research, understand their cultural norms, practices, and values, or consult with experts. And that just may be like, hey, Andrew, I have a student who is a Chinese American and I have no idea what foods they eat. Can we sit down for 10, 15 minutes and let me know what are some foods that might be common for you? In the same way that he's like, hey, Blanca, I just walked into this Bolivian person's home and they're eating this weird looking food. I have no idea what it is, but how can I help? Like, there's different ways, you don't have to just go to like seminars and like some guru of South American culture. You have other BCBAs and a community of people who are from diverse places, and we can all work together to kind of build up our learners. Andrew, I saw you unmute, so I'm always excited.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that 100%. Again, with the example of my Asian American client, they eat a lot of food that is not American, and not a lot of stuff that you'll see on like a TV show or commercial that you'll see quite commonly. So, but it didn't make sense for me to teach him, like, oh, that's a hot dog, that's a hamburger. He's like, he's never going to eat that stuff. He really loves eating the Tibetan food that his grandma makes for him, and it's delicious. It's delicious food. I don't blame him. So I I want him to be able to, communicate those foods that, he's commonly eating. Beef fried rice is one of his favorite things, and
Oh,
that's he has such a limited repertoire already. Just getting him to ask for his favorite types of foods is so important, and it's so absolutely socially significant. And that's all I wanted to share. I took the time again and effort to connect with the parent and figuring out what kinds of foods that the child likes, figuring out whether or not they are able to identify it with words or gestures or something. And that's a jumping off point for, teaching the child not only what the word means in association to, in terms of like verbal behavior, I'm requesting for it, but just it's also, I feel the child has a right to know about their culture as well. Even if they are autistic or even if they have some type of developmental disability and they may not quote unquote understand it, I still, they are human beings just like you and I are, and I feel like they should know, more about their culture in ways that we can make them understand. And this is one of the ways.
absolutely. And, I think the one thing that I do want to add on to here is that when we're being culturally sensitive, we are not removing the child from their current cultural environment. It's not to say that, because our child is Asian American and they eat foods that they would never eat, burgers, french fries. It's not that we're not going to teach them what burgers or french fries are, but we're not going to penalize them. We're not going to say that they don't have a repertoire in place, or that the assessment, they're below a certain performance level because they're not tacting the foods that we know. They may be able to tack multiple different foods. It just might not be the foods that we eat, the foods that our
Yeah.
culture is open to. And so we really want to walk that fine line between, yes, social integration and an ability to interact with peers and there's in a social setting, which might be a culture different for them, is important. But we do not want to do that at the cost of the student's autonomy, at the cost of the student's culture. Yeah, I think that's a very important thing to say. And Andrew, you bring up very, very good points. I love it when you unmute.
Thank you.
The next step in this checklist that we have for our providers is building those cultural competencies, which a lot of you are doing right now. So if you're journaling, say yay me in your journal and say great job, because you take a cultural competency training, you go to workshops, you learn about these things, you read case studies, which is what we've been doing our whole time together. And we expose ourselves to different research, to different webinars, to different case studies, all to build up our arsenal as providers to be able to say, I'm going in and I feel prepared and I have my check boxes here and I can really help this learner and I can really move forward with them. And then what we're always really wanting to have in this field, and I think it's something that we need to make sure we're always doing, is that we're collaborating and we're communicating, that we're really having open dialogues with our clients and with our families. And sometimes our clients cannot advocate for themselves. And that's where the family is very, very important, where we want to make sure that just because a child cannot communicate with us effectively in the moment, that we're not just disregarding their needs and who they are as an individual, that we're using whatever advocacy role that we can to make sure that our learner is not just being assimilated into a culture that is not theirs, but that we are being cognizant of the role that families play, that we're actively listening, and that we're trying to understand both our family's perspectives and the client's perspective. It's very, very important. And sometimes when we're given that, the professional, the therapist, the ABA person role, sometimes families feel discouraged to question us, to speak up, to say something that we're doing is not aligned with them. And so we should be the ones to create an open dialogue and safe and respectful environment.
Yes, here I am unmuted.
Yeah.
I want to just jump on that as well. I want to encourage other fellow providers and BCBAs to, reach out to their parents and build that relationship. You are their child's, provider, and you are there to help them. And the parent, is one of the biggest advocates for their child, obviously. So it's such a brilliant idea, and I totally recommend just spending a day just to set some time aside to talk with the parent and get to know them as a person and as their culture and their history. Because you will find something worthwhile that is relevant to your programming. It's not it won't be useless. It'll definitely be informative. It doesn't hurt. Um does not benefit you from having that type of conversation.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I'm telling you guys, keep looking for the unmutes from Andrew because we're loving it here. And then, as we were talking before, part of this thing in the checklist is, are we customizing our interventions? Are our assessments, are our goals, our intervention plans, are they relevant? Are they socially significant? Do they encompass what cultural factors and cultural backgrounds and values that our students and our learners have? It's very, very important. And I think this step 5 is very important once you get into the actual doing the work with the student. Not to get lost in those assessments, and don't let those assessments be your only lifelines. There are a lot of other things and ways that we can adapt goals and LTOs, STOs, targets that are more relevant and culturally sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic on the topic about assessment, I was mentioning earlier about the VB map and the tacting goals. For those who don't know what tacting is just labeling. Um, there's also an aspect of the VB map which there's the echoic portion, in which that you want to see if the child is able to repeat certain sounds. And something to also consider is the cultural thing to consider in that situation is that sometimes the child, the families that they grow up with, the language that they grow up with, sometimes there's just the literal phonetics are, some of those sounds, like was it the L sound is hard for Chinese speakers. So if you are using an assessment where it asks something like, oh, see if the child could say back R, or like can they make that sound? And then if the child grows up in a predominantly Chinese household where they're just hearing that language 99% of the time, there's high chances are that they don't have that that sound. They are not able to make that sound physically, so that might affect your data during that assessment. So yeah, as Blanca was saying, I encourage BCBAs and providers to tailor it as much as possible to fit their cultural needs, because there's still ways that you can target that specific skill, but in a way that makes sense to them and something that's respectful to them culturally, as what this whole webinar is about.
Yes, yes. And, you know, uh, a core memory for me was when one of my siblings was being assessed for selective mutism. I've seen the VB map and I've seen other echoic assessments, and it's really important to take into consideration what we're actually targeting. We're not targeting whether the student knew that sound, right? We're not testing for does the student know A, E, I, O, U? No, we just want to know if they can echo the sounds that we give them reliably. And this provider will always be someone who I keep dear to my heart. They did the assessment in Spanish for my sister for the echoic section, and she mastered it 100%. There were no issues with her echoics. When they did it in English, at the time we weren't speaking English because we grew up for 5 years in our house before preschool speaking Spanish. We didn't know any sounds or had difficulties making those sounds. And so, it was above and beyond, but it meant the world. And that meant that my sister was able to get adequate services, not services that were like, oh, yeah, I think it's just like an intellectual thing. Let's put her in these services for how many years, and then they don't do anything for her because they didn't assess properly. So yes, 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 and yes, Andrew. Yes, yes, and yes.
Perfect example. Thank you for sharing.
And then again, cultural sensitivities and practices. So, our language and communication. We want to be very mindful of how we communicate and what language we use in the homes. Our reward systems is a big one. We want to make sure that how we're rewarding our students is respectful to their culture. I will say, even outside of like the standard definitions of culture, you know, in my household, screen time and sweets were heavily monitored. We weren't just, you know, really given access to that. We had a lot of things, or you know, I will say, when we were given sweets, and they were specific sweets to Bolivia called sapitos, which means frogs, I would work for that even now. At 25, you tell me run a mile for this sapito and I will do it. But it's like knowing me and who I am, you know, what reinforcers work. And sometimes those reinforcers are not things, I promise you, they are not readily available in the American system. And it's important. It's very important to be mindful of these things. Step 7, and again, we say it all the time, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate with our family. Their involvement is important, and when we're training them, it's important. We want to make sure that we're getting feedback from our families, and we want to make sure that we're offering, you know, cultural competency and training to the family members. In the same way that we need to adjust to their culture, sometimes families need to adjust to the culture that they're in at the moment. I cannot tell you how many families of Hispanic backgrounds that I've worked with who are new to the country, who just started getting services, who do not speak the language, who do not know what is expected of their child, who are struggling to do people like their homework is it's not in their language. In the same way that we want to train to assimilate to their culture, we want to help them assimilate to ours and find that middle ground. And then ongoing evaluation. We want to make sure that we have that feedback loop, right? Open communication, maintenance, because the families and the clients and us are all collaborating and we're all working on things together. And then we want to make sure that we are continuously collecting data. And if we are coming up with error patterns or overall descending trends, which basically means that our intervention method is not working, go through your everyday training as a BCBA of like, why is this happening? Why are we seeing error patterns? Where is the problem? But then also, I invite you to factor in, am I targeting something that has nothing of value to the student? Am I targeting something that is culturally insignificant? Let that also be a part of your data analysis, not just textbook. Sometimes we got to remember to move out from the textbook. And then steps 9 and 10. We want to make sure that we are upholding ethical considerations and that we're seeking supervision and consultation. You know, maybe when we're having troubles with things related to cultural competency and discrimination and diversity, that we are being firm, that we are reporting, that we are making sure that we are being respectful and that we are adhering to those ethical practices. And then, you know, when you come up into situations within supervision realms, which I hope all of us get good supervisors and supervisors who are willing to discuss and talk to us and work with us, you want to touch base. You want to say, hey, I'm working with this family and I don't know their background. I need help. Ask for help. Look for those people to help give you some information. And then, you know, look into these diverse cultures and backgrounds, because it is a very beautiful thing when you can meet a student and give them their progress, but also be attuned and respectful to their home, to their family, and to their autonomy and their individuality as a person. And reflect, evaluate, and look at your growth. Professional developments, you know, you want to continuously go over your reflections, your cultural biases, because they're always changing. We're always thinking new things. We're always looking at different opportunities to grow, opportunities to have, you know, developments in cultural competencies. What works today may not work tomorrow. So it's very important to take those things into consideration in the same way that we all take CEUs because we want to stay up to date with ABA practices. The same thing when it comes to professional development in terms of cultural competency. All right. So I think Andrew and I have added many assessments thus far throughout this. And one of the things that I really, really want to take into consideration is that discussion of cultural competency and assessment tools. This is going to be a brief discussion, but if this is something that like really resonates with you guys, and this is something that you may want to learn about in the future, you might see Andrew and I again. And please, if that's the case, reach out, email, let us know. But I'm going to dive right back into it. So cultural competences and ABA practices are ways that we can merge that cultural competency with our assessment tools. And the one that I like to use, and which most people are familiar with, is the VB map. And we want to make sure that we are recognizing and respecting diverse cultures and backgrounds of our clients, while also tailoring these standard VB map like interventions that are very, the same questions for every learner. How do we adapt? How do we tailor these, very well structured, very well documented, and very effective ways of assessment? How do we use that and make it meaningful for each individual child's need, and not just tick off some boxes? You know what I mean? So let's do an example. So let's look at cultural sensitivity when we're doing a language assessment. ABA providers should be sensitive to the client's primary language and dialect. If the client comes from a bilingual or multilingual household, assess their communication skills in both languages, recognizing the value of each. And that's, the perfect example I brought up of, like, we did not speak English in the home. So when the assessment was done in English, my sister completely bombed it. She was at 0 responding, below grade level. She did it in Spanish. She was above grade level. She knew what she was doing. She knew what she was having. So it's a perfect example there of making sure that we're assessing in both languages. It may be a little bit more work for us, but that little bit more work goes a long way for our learners, for our families, and for our students. Cultural variations. So consider that language development milestones may vary across cultures. Providers should be aware of these variations and not impose a one-size-fits-all standard. I cannot emphasize this enough. Please, 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 please remember that no one learner is the same. No one household is the same. No presentation of behaviors are the same. The same thing is true when our assessments. Our assessments should never be one size fits all. They should be guiding us, but they should not be, we shouldn't be like rotely, almost like numbed out doing these assessments. We want to make sure that they are relevant. Assessing the environment. Cultural familiarity. Create an assessment environment that is culturally familiar and welcoming. Ensure that assessment materials such as pictures and objects, like Andrew, 10 points plus to Andrew, are culturally sensitive and relevant to the client's background. Please look at Andrew's example of, tacting different food items that are relevant to their culture. And then family involvement. I will never, ever get tired of saying this, but encouraging family members who may have cultural insights to be present during the assessment. Their input can really help us as providers. And that gives us, we don't have to take a CEU. We have the cultural expert there, the mom, the person who is creating the environment, dad, brother, sister. If they're sitting in the assessment and, Andrew pulls up a picture of a Nebraskan field, mom's like, sorry, I don't even know what that is. And now we know because mom was there, mom was involved, mom was present. Same thing for other members of the family. Then we're looking at things like cultural goals, goal setting. I love this. Gosh, I spent seminar after seminar, class after class on goals. And I know as BCBAs, all we do is make goals. And so it's really important that we make sure that our goals are, we collaborate with the client and the family to set communication goals that align with their values. For example, if a family values nonverbal communication, incorporate that into their goals with gestures and body language targets. Cultural relevance. We want to make sure that our communication goals are culturally relevant. So if a client's culture places importance on formal greetings, we want to make sure that we're teaching them appropriate greetings for their culture. And then intervention strategies. We want to really be sensitive when we are teaching these cultural sensitivity in teaching, right? So when teaching communication skills, we want to make sure that our strategies are aligned with what is sensitive and true to their culture. The biggest example I always use is eye contact, right? Some cultures do not find that respectful. Other cultures are very averse to intense eye contact. Turn taking, social interactions, those are all things to be considered about. I love this one because I can always talk about my favorite candy, sapitos. They only find it in Bolivia. Unfortunately, I have to go on an 8-hour plane to get it, so it might not be the most accessible reinforcer, but when you are choosing reinforcers for our students, make sure they're not reinforcing because you think they're reinforcing because they actually work for our students. And sometimes culture will be able to teach us what are foods or activities that our students like and what motivate them. And sometimes that might even motivate communication in this example. Feedback and collaboration. I've talked about this multiple times. Open dialogue with families, practitioners, BCBAs. cultural experts, and sometimes don't think that the cultural expert isn't the mom, the dad, the brother, or the sister, or the person in the home. Very important here. And then assessment modifications, respect for diversity, and cultural responsiveness. We want to make sure that we're adapting our assessment tools to the current culture, that we are providing ourselves with training for ourselves in terms of this training, for example, going to webinars, opening up training opportunities for the families, and that we're being willing to adapt to our learner and their cultural environment. That willingness is a very big part. When we're showing respect for our culture, for our family's cultural identities, for the home that we're going into, we can really make a lot of change with our intervention methods and our goals. And that is Andrew's cue to unmute.
Awesome. Thank you. So here is our last code word for this webinar. The code word is diversity. Make sure y'all write this down so you could have both of your words to get your CEU certificate at the end of this webinar. So we'll keep it up for another 10 seconds and then we will wrap up our discussion.
Yeah, and I will, because this is my favorite thing to do, doomsday clock, 3, 2, 1. Oh man. On. I hope you all have been with us and present and paying attention. I really love how specific those code words are to the seminars. I always try to guess them. But to wrap up, I really want to highlight a few key takeaway points. Cultural competence and ABA practices alongside assessment tools like the VB map are essential for effective and respectful interventions. We really want to make sure that we are recognizing and respecting diverse cultural backgrounds of our clients so that then our approaches are more towards ensuring individualized care. We want to collaborate with clients and their families. We want to make sure that we're using strategies that are culturally significant and that we are constantly adapting to the needs of our learners and their environment. And then ongoing culture competency training. Please do not just take this one webinar, check off your ethical CEU, and then forget all about cultural competency.
Oh, yeah. There are tons of cultural competency trainings and webinars and resources out there. Simple Google search will do you justice. But here at MPG, this is the beginning of much more to come. I think we're going to be expanding a lot more on culture as our practice. We work in a very metropolitan area, of course, New York City, the cultural melting pot of the whole country. So it's super important, all of these key takeaway points as providers and for our parents and families that we work with. It's all very relevant for us to be culturally aware of all of these things.
100%. And, I will definitely say that there are a lot of points here that we can spend an entire webinar on. This is just a surface level examination of cultural competencies and ABA and culture. There's so much more to delve into. There's so much more that we can tackle. So I think it is very, very important that you take the time to see what else is out there because we're not the only ones out there.
Yep, we're just touching the surface regarding this topic, but like I was saying, super excited that we can bring you more content regarding this training. Yeah, thank you so much, Blanca, for putting together this lovely presentation. Hopefully everybody has learned a lot from this with all the examples and your experience. It was all very, very helpful.
I'm very excited to have been able to do this with you guys. And here's the references page, and then I will move on to the next page because I think I've said a bunch of times, feel free to reach out, tell us where your opinions are. So Andrew's going to let you know how to do that. But thank you guys so much for letting me talk about something that I'm really passionate about. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. So you can move on to the next slide, please. So there we go. So if you want to follow us on our socials, here is all of our information. Check us out. I will be figuring out a way for you guys to submit questions regarding this specific webinar directly on our Thinkific website. But if not, please reach out to us via email. You can move on to the next slide, Blanca, please. My email is at the bottom, professionaldevelopment@manhattanpsychologygroup. reach out to me if any questions for me or Blanca regarding this webinar, or for any questions regarding our webinar series for Psych and ABA. Feel free to click through these links and check them out if you have any more questions. And again, thank you for attending this asynchronous webinar. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, guys.